And remember, Mary, their mothers have had 5 parts per million of these chemicals in their drinking water for 2 weeks. That's a lot. Much, much more than we're putting in the river. Mary looked away from the rats. She remembered the beautiful afternoon that they had spent with John's children, sailing on the clear blue water. "John, these waste products are dangerous," she said. "We've got to stop putting them in the river." Of course, of course." John put his hand on her arm to comfort her. But it was the same hand, the hand that had held the rats. "Of course we'll stop it, if we need to, Mary. The company can build machines to clean the waste products. I'll start my report for David Wilson next week." "But—" She turned round to face him. His hand fell from her arm. "Don't you think we should stop making the paint now, John? Perhaps it'll take years to build those machines, and we're putting the chemicals into the river right now." A shadow crossed his face. His eyes looked at hers, then away, out of the window. "I don't think we need to do that now, Mary. We're putting very little into the river at the moment. And the company will build those machines, won't they?" She remembered her long years of work, the hundreds of unsuccessful experiments. She touched his hand and smiled. "I hope so, John," she said. "I really hope so." She turned and went quickly out of the room. 6. The report. John's report took longer than he had thought. It was nearly 6 weeks later when he went to discuss the results with David Wilson. Mr. Wilson wasn't a scientist. He was a businessman. He knew how to run a business, how to make money. "Thanks for coming, John." David Wilson came out from behind his desk and shook hands with John. They sat in 2 big, comfortable armchairs by the window. David Wilson's office was large, with a thick carpet and beautiful pictures on the walls. From the window, John could see the river and the woods and fields on the other side. He felt comfortable, happy, safe. "I've read your report," Wilson began. Then he stopped and lit a cigarette. "Not very good, is it?" "What?" John stared at him in surprise. Wilson smiled and moved his hand through the clouds of smoke. "No, no, don't worry. I don't mean the report is bad, of course not. You've worked very hard and done your job well. What I mean is, I don't like the ideas at the end of the report." "What's wrong with them?" "They're too expensive." The 2 men stared at each other for a moment, and John felt cold and sick in his stomach. Wilson smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that John liked. "Look, John," he said, "your report says that we should build some new machines to clean up the waste products before they go into the river, right? And those machines will cost £2 million? Where do you think we can find all that? Money doesn't grow on trees, you know." "No, of course not." John's mouth was dry. He took a drink of water and felt his hand shaking. "But we're selling a lot of the new paint. We're making millions of pounds every month from that, aren't we?" "We're doing very well, yes," said Wilson. "But if we spend £2 million to build these new machines, the paint will have to cost more, and we won't sell so much." "But we've got to do it," said John. "These waste products are much more dangerous than I'd thought. Didn't you read that in my report? When I put the chemicals in rats' drinking water, some of the baby rats were born without eyes and ears. One didn't have any legs, and one had 6. He shivered. And some were born without legs when they drank only 2 parts per million. We can't put those chemicals in the river." "Of course I read that, John. I read your report very carefully indeed. And your report also says that on most days we put less than 2 parts per million into the river. No, wait. Listen to me for a minute. We both know that no drinking water comes out of this part of the river, don't we? And in 2 kilometres, the river goes out into the sea. So why is it dangerous? Nobody is ever going to drink it, John. We don't need to build these new machines." John thought of his children, sailing on the river in their boat. He thought of the seals and people fishing, and little children playing on the beach and swimming. "We've got to build them," he said. David Wilson looked at him carefully. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and hard. "Listen to me, John. You're a very good scientist, and we're lucky to have you in this company. But you're not a businessman, and I am. Look at this." He picked up a sheet of paper and held it across the table for John to see. It showed how much money the company had. "We borrowed £10 million last year, and we employed 400 more people. Think how much that means to a small town like this." "I know," said John, "but—" "Just a minute. Listen to me. If we build these cleaning machines of yours, people will lose their jobs. A lot of people. This company can't afford to borrow any more money, John. We just can't do it." John stood up. "And what happens if people get ill because of this? Have you thought of that? What will the newspapers say then?" "No one will get ill, because no one drinks that water, John. The newspapers will never know about it." "They will if I tell them." There was a long silence. Then David Wilson stood up. He walked past John Duncan without looking at him, and sat down behind his desk. When he looked up, his eyes were cold and grey, like stones from the beach. "If you do that, John, I shall say you're a liar. You'll lose your job, you'll have to sell your house, and go back to living in a nasty little flat. You'll never get another job, and you'll never have a house or any money again. You'll just be an old man walking the streets without friends or money. Is that what you want?" John didn't answer. He stood for a long time and stared at David Wilson, and didn't say a word. After nearly 2 minutes, Wilson smiled, a thin, quiet smile. But if you stay with us, you will be paid twice as much next year. And no one will ever be hurt, because no one will ever drink that water. He got up from his desk, came round to the front, and held out his hand. John stood still for a long moment. Then he shook hands. "Think about it, John," said David Wilson. John Duncan turned and walked slowly towards the door. 7. Christine and Simon. Mary talked to Mr. Wilson too, but it was no good. She came out looking tired and very sad. For many months she argued with David Wilson about the danger of the waste products, but he would not listen to her. And so, 18 months after John's report, Mary decided to move to another company. She was pleased, because it was a more important job, but that wasn't the reason she was going. She knew that the cleaning machines would never be built. John was sad to see her go. He had enjoyed working with her, and she had come to his house several times over the last year and a half. His children liked her now. They had never been so friendly with any woman since their mother had died. On her last day, Mary and John had lunch in the factory restaurant together. "You don't have to go, you know, Mary," John said. "This company is very successful, and it's growing all the time. Your new paint has meant 400 new jobs, all because of your discovery. This isn't a poor town anymore. It's becoming successful, rich. People will want to move here from other places." He talked about the new sports centre at Andrew's school, which was built with money from the paint company. There were 2 big new shops in the town as well, and a new theatre, and a lot of new houses. "And it's all because of you," he said. "It's wonderful, Mary, don't you think?" He smiled at her across the table, and took her hand in his. She looked at him quietly. He had changed a lot since he had first started working at the factory. For the first 6 months after he had got the job, he had been really happy and lively. She had always known where he was in the factory because he was always laughing or singing to himself. But for the last 18 months, he had been much quieter. He was always busy, but he didn't sing or laugh, and he didn't often look Mary in the eyes. And when he was alone, he looked tired and sad. She took her hand away from his, gently. "You know why I'm going, John," she said. "I know what's going into the river, and I don't like to think about it. You should leave too, and get a job in another company." "I'm too old." John stared at her angrily. "It isn't easy for me to get a new job. And Mary, the company has been making the paint for more than 2 years now, and no one's been hurt, have they?" Mary didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "Only you." "What do you mean, only me?" She looked at him sadly. His head was bald now. He was beginning to look like an old man. Once, she had wanted to marry him. Now, she was pleased that he hadn't asked her. "Oh, I just meant your leg, of course."